Color grading is the final touch that helps you fully realize your vision in filmmaking. Here, I want to show you 3 levels of color grading workflows you can use in DaVinci Resolve to help you reach your full potential. The first workflow will begin with what I would do if I only had the free version of Resolve with no additional plugins, progressing to my current workflow that helps me achieve the look I desire in all of my work. With each workflow, we'll introduce tools that do have a cost, but I have found them to be worth the price for achieving the colors I want while requiring fewer adjustments with simpler methods. The cheaper the workflow, the more effort you'll need to put in, whereas the higher the cost, the fewer adjustments will be needed to achieve beautiful colors. No matter the workflow, I still follow a similar node structure, and with each adjustment, I'll explain my thinking so you can learn how and why I color the way I do. Let's start with the free workflow I would have used when starting in DaVinci Resolve. You don't need the studio version for this workflow, so try this method out if you're a beginner. As you progress in your career, you can move up in workflows. Okay, so here's the clip I am working on and the node structure I ended up with. Instead of starting in the first node, I added a second node to place a color space transform to turn my log footage and transform it into a Rec 709 space that I can work with. I film everything on my Sony a7 IV and S-Log3, so here are the settings I use to go from straight out of camera to a place where I can begin working. Depending on the camera you use, your settings might vary, but if you don't have a LUT, this is how you can start your workflow when working with log footage. Now that the footage is transformed, I return to the first node to make my primary adjustments. You can see the footage is pretty overexposed, and I did that to retain the information in the darker parts of the image and keep that detail. So I begin by lowering the offset to get a more balanced image to start. I then go to the highlights here and drop that down almost all the way to get some more of the detail back in the brighter parts of the image. I follow that by increasing the contrast in the image and moving the pivot point to the left to open the frame more. I move to the other 3 wheels, the gamma, lift, and gain, where I will further push and pull the image. I raise the gamma wheel up a bit and drop the greens here slightly to add some magenta into the midtones. I also go to the lift and drop that down slightly. With this shot, I decided not to touch the gain wheel after all. I warmed up the image with the temp here and lowered the tint towards the green a bit so the entire image isn't too magenta from me increasing it in the gamma. I lower the shadows here by 2.5 and then I lower the mid detail by -10 to smooth out some details throughout the shot. Here you can see the primary adjustments I did. It made a big difference after transforming the log footage. In the third node, I want to make a film curve. So I go to the curves and here I add default anchors so I can more accurately lower the lighter parts of the image and raise the lower parts of the image within the curve to add a bit of that film look to my digital footage. Here's the final curve I ended up with. Now I'll start adjusting the colors in the fourth node. I will use the hue versus hue, hue versus saturation, and hue versus luminance curves. Starting with the hue versus hue, I add points to each of the colors so I'm not shifting other colors when I'm working on certain ones. And I do this in each curve category. For the reds, I pushed it down to the left a bit to start fixing up my skin tones. I go a little further with the yellows as the trees behind me are mostly affected by that color. After that, I move on to the blues and raise it up, affecting my shirt and some of it behind me. In the hue versus saturation, I will make more drastic changes by mainly lowering the saturation in the same colors I just worked on, the reds, yellows, and blues. Then in the hue versus luminance, I raised the reds, lowered the yellows, and slightly raised the blues. In the fifth node, I wanted to make some adjustments to the colors above me in the frame, so I decided to use a square window. I moved and shaped it above me, so the colors I'm only affecting are mainly the ones on the carousel. I go back to the hue versus hue and use the qualifier to select a couple of the carousel lights so I can shift the hue a bit, dragging each selection down. I use those same points in the hue versus saturation and increase the saturation. And in the hue versus luminance, I use those same points and increase it. It's a slight adjustment and one that can be done after the other steps, but it adds to the overall colors in the look. In the same node, I also went back to the primaries and decreased the magenta tint to them. All adjustments I'm making here are to my personal taste, so you don't have to make the same changes in your image if it doesn't need it. This is all to help you see what you can do in your work. Following that node, next up we get to color grading. All these nodes before help you get a good base, so when you start grading, you can push the colors even further and add your look. I start by decreasing the reds in the lift wheel to add teal to the darker parts. In the gamma, I warm up the image, pushing the wheel in the direction of orange. I then go to the log wheels in the same node and lower the greens to add magenta back into the shadows so anything that is black looks black and doesn't have a weird tint to them. In the midtones, I warm up the image even more. I go back to the color wheels and push the gain wheel slightly towards the pink. I move on to the 7th node where I will increase the contrast once again using this curve and enabling editable spleens to make the image pop. Doing this really helps give the image a little more to stand out. In the next node, I use the color slice tool to adjust my skin tones. If you haven't seen the last color grading tutorial I put out on this channel, I highly recommend checking it out to help you perfect your skin tones. Here, I turned on the highlights for the skin and shifted the center to the left, which affects more of what I want to change. I also slightly increased the density of my skin and the saturation to go with it. In the final node for this workflow, I add the glow effect for finishing touches to complete the look. I start by lowering the global blend and then change the composite type from normal to soft light. I scroll back up to lower the shine threshold and to drop down the spread to open the image back up again. Scrolling down, I lower the gain a bit as well as the gamma. And that is the final touch on the free workflow I would use in DaVinci Resolve. For the next workflow, we are adding one tool that helps you improve your overall colors right from the start. We are following a similar node structure from the free workflow, but in the second node, instead of using a color space transform, we are using a phantom LUT. To me and many of you watching, I'm sure you find ARRI digital cameras to be the standard for color science in cinema. I love the colors those cameras produce, and for good reason. That has to be the look we aim for when working with digital cameras. These phantom LUTs help you turn your log footage into the colors you can get from an ARRI camera, and they have a great selection of camera profiles they work with, so if you don't have a Sony camera like me, you still might be able to get phantom LUTs that work with your camera. My favorite phantom LUT to use is the tungsten look, and here I chose to go with the legacy option since I overexposed the shot. This will bring the exposure back down without having to really lower the offset wheel. I go back to the first node and lower the offset just slightly to get the exposure I want and drop the highlights all the way down. I added contrast back in and moved the pivot to the left to open the image. I increased the midtones in the gamma wheel and lowered the lift. I dropped the shadow slightly and warm up the image. I pushed the tint towards the magenta to balance it a bit to my liking and increased the color boost by 1. I finished in the first node by lowering the mid detail by -10. You can already see a difference between the first workflow and this one just by adding a phantom LUT to your image. In the third node, I added the exact same film curve from the first workflow, adding default anchors to make it easier to create. In the fourth node, I still did some color adjustments, but I feel like I did fewer changes here than in the free workflow since I have a better base to start with. In the hue versus hue curve, I only adjusted the blues to slightly rotate it down. In the hue versus saturation, I dropped the reds to help my skin tones. I decreased the blues a bit and the magenta even more. In the luminance, I increased the reds to help my skin and slightly lowered the blues. In the fifth node, I made the exact same window and adjustments I did in the free workflow, so check that out if you want a further breakdown of the window I made to shift the colors on the carousel. After all these nodes, it's time to grade in this one. I dropped the reds to add teal to the darker parts. I added warmth back in with the gamma wheel and went to the log wheels to balance out the grade. I added magenta back in the shadows by decreasing the greens so the black parts would be black and wouldn't have a weird tint to it. And I also warmed up the midtones even more. I went back to the color wheels and pushed the gain towards the magenta a bit. In the 7th node, just like the free workflow, I made the image pop by enabling editable spleens and pushing this curve. For the 8th node, I add the color slice tool to adjust my skin tones. I turn on the skin tone highlight and push the center all the way to the left so all of my skin is affected. All I had to do here was shift the hue to the left a bit to -10. In the final node, I use glow once again. I lower the global blend and change the composite type to soft light. I decreased the shine threshold as well as the spread. Lastly, I lower the gain and increase the gamma. This is the final look I created with this second workflow, adding in the phantom LUT. For this final workflow, we are adding one more tool to the end of the grade that will add some film qualities to our look. This time, I start with the normal tungsten phantom LUT instead of the legacy version. So in the first node, I lower the offset a bit more than the second workflow and drop the highlights almost all the way down. I add contrast back in and open up the pivot. I raise the gamma, lower the lift, and lower the shadows a bit as well. I warm up the shot in the temp, shift the tint towards the magenta, and boost the colors by 1. I finish the first node with lowering the mid detail by -10. Going to node 3, I use the same film curve I created from the first two workflows. And instead of adjusting the colors in the 4th node, I created the same window from the previous workflows to adjust the colors from the carousel behind me. In the next node, I create the same color adjustments as the last workflow, cooling the lift and warming it up in the gamma. Then I went to the log wheels to balance the image to make the blacks black and warm it up a bit again. Then I went back to the color wheels to shift the gain slightly to the pinks. In the following node, I use editable spleens once again to make the image pop just like the previous workflows. And now in this last node, I love to use 𝔸𝔻𝕆𝔝𝔸𝕄𝔸 to add film qualities to my footage. I found this to be a great plugin to emulate the film look that can work with any footage you use. My favorite color film profile to use has been Kodak Vision 3 500T. You can push and pull the film profile, and I usually like the look of it being pulled to the right. Then I go to the print tab and add some contrast back into the shot. I raise the color density of the whole image here and slightly raise the exposure. I scroll up to the expand tab and mess with the black and white points until I like the look of the image. Now I like to add grain to my shot. There are many beautiful grain profiles you can use, and I always switch it up, but for this shot I use the 35mm ISO 500 profile and lower the amount a bit. With 𝔸𝔻𝕆𝔝𝔸𝕄𝔸 you can also add halation and use the different profiles they have as well, but I went with a custom subtle look with these settings here. There are many other things you can customize here with 𝔸𝔻𝕆𝔝𝔸𝕄𝔸, so you can really push that film look in your projects, but for this shot, this is all I needed. If you want, you could do one more node for the glow effect, but I was already happy with this final image. Remember, you don't have to make the exact same adjustments I do throughout these workflows, and you don't have to use both plugins I have for your work to come out the way you want to. If you enjoyed this color grading breakdown, make sure to leave a like, drop a comment below with any questions you may have, and subscribe if you're new to the channel. I'll see you in the next one.